In this segment, we're going to talk about a portion of Chapter 7 from American Media History. We're going to talk about muckraking. I want to point out that we've skipped a couple of chapters in the text. It was a very difficult decision for me on what to include and what not to. But you need to realize that the press in the United States was tremendously impacted by the Civil War and then the Progressive Era. But we aren't going to talk about those. We are going to move and talk just briefly about a period, very unique period of American journalism in the early 1900s. So first of all, what do we mean by muckraking? Well, muckrakers were journalists, most of whom worked for magazines at the time. Magazines had long national reach. They saw corruption and they set out to inform the public about it. They were amateur writers and some professional writers who saw a lot of corruption going on in the US and were committed to seeing change. This period is known for its passion for exposure for things that were going wrong in the judgment of the journalists as well as their publishers. Nothing was off limits to write about. So what were they looking at? Well, they were looking at a society that had been caught up in the grasp of very wealthy capitalists. These are known as robber barons. They were on the rise, and as the author says, they gorged themselves on the nation's wealth. Let me just read you some of the names and the industries that they were part of, or that they controlled. J. Gould, William H. Vanderbilt, Collis P. Huntington, James J. Hill, and Edward Harriman were all railroad magnates. John D. Rockefeller, oil. Andrew Carnegie, steel. J. Cook and J. P. Morgan, banking and finance. William Clark, mining. And Philip D. Armour, meat packing. These were such influential men. They bought and sold politicians. They were successful in doing away with any sort of government regulation or interference on anything that would make money for them. They exploited cheap immigrant labor, and they used children and women. There were no labor laws or labor policies. We had no environmental protection, so they raped the land, in particular the railroad and mining magnates and oil magnates. And again, they bought politicians so that nothing interfered with their accumulation of wealth. The muckrakers' topics included crooked politicians, exploitation of children in mills and factories, corrupt police, food adulteration, prostitution across state lines, fraudulent claims for patents, and other unscrupulous business practices. Muckrakers, as I said, wrote primarily in magazines, although a number of them published books as a result of their research. But they were also, some of them wrote for newspapers. And in 1870, shortly after the end of the Civil War, there were 574 publications, muckraker publications. There were 2,600 by 1909. Now, part of the reason that magazines were able to be a medium of such influence was the expansion of the high school system and urbanization. As you can see, public schools in 1870 had an enrollment of 7 million students. By 1900, it had more than doubled to 5.5 million, and the illiteracy rate had decreased to 11%. So the population was more educated, and we're ready to hear about some of the corruption that they saw around them. So we're going to talk about who some of these people were. The one I want to talk about first is Ida Tarbell. Obviously, she's a woman. She is known as the Queen of the Muckrakers. She went to work for McClure's magazine, which was one of the dominant ones, and she was concerned with justice. So she wrote a very successful book series called The Early Life of Lincoln. This series brought in 75,000 new readers to McClure's. But her most important work in terms of muckraking was her history of the Standard Oil Company. It took her 5 years to write, but once it was out, it took on a life of its own. The history of Standard Oil Company exposed the illegal manipulation that Standard Oil was doing. And as a result, the Supreme Court of the United States ordered the breakup of Standard Oil into smaller companies. So it broke up the oil monopoly that Standard had had. Next is a gentleman named Lincoln Steffens. He was hired by McClure, but he wasn't the greatest editor. So he wanted to learn, he wanted to be a journalist, and he found himself in St. Louis writing the Tweed Days in St. Louis. What that refers to is a very corrupt period in New York politics during the the Gilded Age, so the late 1900s, when Boss Tweed literally controlled politics in New York. He bought and sold, and so that was a very momentous time that unfortunately we didn't have a chance to study. But Lincoln Steffens used that infamous name to describe what he found in St. Louis. He exposed bribery dealings that had been taking place in St. Louis, and his success in that led him to go to other cities and look for the same thing. And of course, he found it in Philadelphia, Minneapolis, and more in St. Louis. So he exposed all kinds of things, from corrupt police to corrupt politicians, and as well as labor corruption. So he eventually combined all of these articles into a book called The Shame of the Cities, which brought about some major changes in all of the cities that were affected. David Graham Phillips wrote perhaps one of the most influential, although they all were very powerful, but his was The Treason of the Senate. Theodore Roosevelt was president at the time, and he's the one who coined the phrase muckrakers, because he was very, astonished at the kind of work that David Graham Phillips was doing. He went to Congress and watched the ways in which the Senate was working. He sat in the balcony, and what he saw was incredible corruption. Now, he was well respected, so what he said, people tended to listen to, and he also wrote for one of the most powerful journalists at the time, William Randolph Hearst. So he was in a position to have people listen. He was very passionate in his writing, and the upshot was that New York Senators Chauncey Depew and Thomas Collier Platt lost their careers as senators. And what he did was expose a process for how senators were chosen, which was not by the people. Our state senators today, after a constitutional amendment that came about because of the treason of the Senate, are elected by popular vote. Before that, they were appointed by political parties in the state, in each state, which was an extremely corrupt process and did not work well at all for citizens. You may know the name Upton Sinclair. He's well known for his book, The Jungle. It shocked the nation about what was going on in the food production industry. Before that, he was known for Manassas, which was about the struggle of abolition in the United States. And so he was approached to write another book about what was called industrial slavery. That is the incredible exploitation of workers in the meatpacking industry, among others. So he went to live among the meat packers in the back of the yards neighborhood in Chicago. And what he observed was so disgusting and so upsetting that he wrote an entire novel, or an entire book called The Jungle. Now, he meant it to be a socialist manifesto. He was concerned about laborers' rights, and that's what his focus was. But the book became known for the surprising realities of Chicago's meat packing business, and the result was that in 1906, Congress passed the Meat Inspection Act. So muckraking's impact. Well, here are some of the outcomes. There was a Federal Reclamation Act of 1902 to stop the exploitation of natural resources. I would also argue that because of muckrakers, President Roosevelt took steps toward preserving our natural resources through the forest preserve system and the national park system. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906, that was not Ida Tarbell, sorry, that was Upton Sinclair, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Finally, in 1916, we had child labor laws, and then 1938, although it was long past the muckraking time, the muckrakers set in motion the need for and the desire for labor standards. So the period of muckraking really only lasted for about 10 years. It came to an end in 1912. What were some of the reasons? Well, some people felt that, the Americans were tired of reading about so much negative stuff. And President Woodrow Wilson had resolved some of the issues that the muckrakers exposed. But many people think it took about 10 years for the businesses that were being attacked to sort of rally themselves and figure out what to do. And they went on the counterattack using advertising and public relations to reposition themselves as the good guys in the eyes of the public. And truly, this was the beginning of public relations in the United States. Why do we want to talk about this period, progressive era of muckraking? Because there's never been anything before or since like it. It established a acceptance of investigative reporting, and American journalists, and journalism was being professionalized at the time, they saw the need for journalism to not only be a fourth estate and keep an eye on the government, but to, on behalf of the people, make sure that corruption in any place was exposed. And so investigative journalism became an important part of professional journalism. It is extremely dangerous for any business or politician who is being reported on. And so the powers that be learned their lesson from muckraking, and we haven't seen anything quite like it since. We have had exposés that brought about tremendous and important change. The Watergate, All the President's Men, that finally ended up bringing down President Richard Nixon. There's a movie out now called Spotlight, which is about the way the Boston Globe investigated corruption in the Catholic Church. So it's not that these things don't occur, it's just that it has never occurred with the same intensity and public support that was there during the progressive era, 1902 to 1912. So this ends our discussion of muckraking. There's an awful lot more in Chapter 7, but we're going to move on to a different set of types of media now. We're going to start looking at electronic media, film, radio, television, and the internet, and that will finish out the course.